Ukrainian forces continue to attack from several different directions in the third week of the counteroffensive. The Russian military is starting to feel the impact of the counterattack and is repositioning units in other sectors of the battlefield to fill the gaps. The Russian army began to move its forces from the eastern bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson to strengthen the defensive lines in Zaporizhia and Donbass. In the past few days, the Russian army has relocated several thousand soldiers, including elite VDV paratroopers and Marines. This redeployment likely reflects Russia's perception that a major Ukrainian offensive along the Dnipro is now less likely after the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam and the consequent flooding. But this may be exactly what the Ukrainian leadership wants to do, pretending to attack in one place to draw Russian reserves from their true target. However, the current Dnipro River crossing will be one of the largest amphibious operations in recent times. Meanwhile, the Russian forces on land continue to suffer significant losses. The Russian casualty rate stabilized in the third week of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. In the last few days, the Russian army has lost an average of 650 soldiers per day. The failures and losses in the front lines of the Russian army have turned the balance upside down. While Russian casualties increase, striking news continues to come from the front. Undoubtedly, the most striking news is the Russian soldiers fleeing from the front line. According to the Ukrainian military, Russian fighters are fleeing the front line in eastern Ukraine as Kiev's counteroffensive gains momentum. The operational update from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that Moscow troops moved away from the front lines in the disputed eastern Luhansk region. The Ukrainian General Staff said that a group of Russian soldiers fleeing their positions, defined as mobilized forces, were found in the Ukrainian village of Novorossiya. It was stated that the search operations for the fleeing soldiers were also carried out by the Russian National Guard. Desertion has become a documented problem for Russian forces in Ukraine. In November 2022, the UK Ministry of Defense stated that Kremlin generals may have authorized the use of weapons against deserters, including allowing fire to cover such flaws after a warning has been issued. In fact, the tactic of shooting deserters attests to the low quality, low morale, and indiscipline of the Russian forces. Earlier this month, footage circulating in the Ukrainian media showed Moscow troops firing at their retreating soldiers. In the last days of May, several dozen armed conflicts fleeing the Luhansk region caused turmoil in Rostov. 39 armed soldiers from the Stormzy detachment fled Lysychansk, Ukraine's occupied Luhansk region. The deserted soldiers were all ex-convicts who went to fight under contract during the escape. A soldier from the self-proclaimed LPR Ministry of State Security was killed while trying to stop the deserters. But the most striking thing here was that some of the deserting Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces. As it is known, conflicts in the eastern and southern axis of Ukraine have flared up considerably. They have begun to feel the heat of war in cities deep in Russia, as well as in Russian cities close to the Ukrainian border. All these developments have pushed the Russian soldiers to the fine line between death and life. While fierce clashes continue on the front lines, the avalanche of Russian casualties has brought the soldiers to a turning point. Having no faith in Vladimir Putin's war, the Russians have begun to look for ways to save themselves. The paths of Russian soldiers have crossed with Ukraine's Compassionate Project. At this point, the I Want to Live project launched in September has saved the lives of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline for Russian soldiers who want to surrender received 3,174 calls in April, an increase of 10% compared to the previous month. In May, this rate increased even more. The rate of surrender of Russian troops peaked when Ukraine's large-scale counteroffensive began in June. The Russians, suffering from mental collapse, even offered to deliver equipment and heavy armored vehicles by calling the hotline. On the other hand, since the start of the summer offensive, the Ukrainian army has been capturing 5 to 10 Russian service personnel per day in the Donbass and Zaporizhia regions. The fact that a total of 70 or more Russian posts were rounded up in a single 7-day period matches the capture rate set in the early days of the war when signs of weakening Russian morale were significant. On the other hand, it was not only the Ukrainian armed forces that captured Russian soldiers. Anti-Kremlin rebels claimed to have captured large numbers of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod, near the Ukrainian border. Paramilitary forces opposing Vladimir Putin's regime had invited the city's governor to meet with them in order to deliver the detainees and hold talks. However, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Russia's Freedom Legion jointly announced that Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov could not find the courage to meet with them, and they would hand over their captives to Ukraine. It seems that counter-offensive operations hold no promise for the Russian army. Shaken by casualties and losing their faith in war, the Russians find a solution by fleeing from the front lines or surrendering. A more piteous end awaits the Russian soldiers who could not carry out these actions voluntarily. These soldiers either lose their lives on the front lines or are captured as prisoners. So what has been happening on the front lines lately while the state of the Russian army is so deplorable? According to a new assessment, Ukrainian troops have pushed Kiev's counterattack into at least 4 sectors of the front line with Russia. According to an analysis by the Institute for the Study of War think tank, counteroffensive operations are largely concentrated in the eastern Next region and parts of the southern Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Heinmeyer said in a statement on social media that Ukrainian forces recaptured the village of Piatkovsky on the southern front. In total, 8 settlements have been liberated this month, and 113 square kilometers of territory have been recaptured. Mailer said this since the start of the counterattack. Russian military officials later denied that Patsatsia was under Ukrainian control. But Russian mill bloggers such as War Gonzo noted that Russian forces had withdrawn. Ukraine allegedly advanced up to a kilometer near Avdiivka in Donetsk. EZU noted that Ukrainian forces continue offensive operations in the south, southwest, and southeast of Volchanovo-Silka, close to the administrative border between the two regions. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine struck a Russian ammunition depot in the temporarily occupied part of the Kherson region. The warehouse was hit in the village of Rakov, about 116 kilometers from the front line. It is possible to damage the depot at this distance using the Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missile or most likely the Tochka TBM. Eyewitnesses said that the ammunition explosion in the warehouse lasted for several hours. The Osin community reported that the repository was located on the territory of the local silo. In another development, Ukrainian forces destroyed a huge ammunition depot south of Melitopol. News sources on both sides believe it was also the result of the Storm Shadow missile attack. The location was pretty obvious as the Russians were seen building and filling warehouses at one of the official train stops on the Melitopol road. Satellite images show that the explosion completely destroyed all buildings in the area and damaged those near the warehouses. The successes at the front, in general, and the destruction of the commanders responsible for the stability of this region, the reserve forces, and warehouses create favorable conditions for further progress. As a result, Ukraine's counterattack continues to move forward with determined steps. The advance of the Kiev troops sows the seeds of fear in the hearts of Russian soldiers. The Russian army is awash with desertions and surrenders. Strong unit of the occupying Russian forces was forced to surrender to the Ukrainian army. Thanks to the unbelievable operation of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army was dealt another big blow. The Ukrainian army, which blockaded the Russian army on the Bakhmut front, carried out an extraordinary operation in Bakhmut. The Russian army, which has been occupying Ukrainian territory for more than a year, has intensified its attacks on the Backbone front. You may have noticed that news about the hot clashes on the Bakhmut front has been appearing frequently lately. So why this persistence of Russian leader Vladimir Putin in the city of Bakhmut? The answer is actually quite simple. Known as the heart of the Donetsk region, Bakhmut, like Soledar, is rich in other ground resources. But the real reason Putin wants this city is its location. After the Ukrainian army recaptured some areas occupied by the Russian army in the Donetsk region, the Russian army wants to turn the city of Bakhmut into a coordination center for the weapons and ammunition that will be sent from Russia to the Russian troops in Donetsk, as well as most of the offensive plans of the Russian army will be planned from the city of Bakhmut. Although Vladimir Putin has concentrated on the city of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army has been continuing its months-long resistance here. This success of the Ukrainian army is based on the strategy implemented by Ukrainian troop commanders. The Ukrainian army has completely taken control of the 17-kilometer border area by creating a large defense line in the city of Bakhmut. Thus, the Russian army does not dare to enter the city of Bakhmut from any region. However, after the recent news that the Russian army lost more than 600 soldiers a day in Bakhmut, the Russian Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov, decided to organize a major attack plan on the city of Bakhmut. The vast majority of the soldiers to be used in this attack are soldiers of the Wagner mercenary company founded by Yevgeny Prigozhin. As it is known, Wagner soldiers previously managed to push back the Ukrainian army in the city of Soledar and completely occupied the city of Salvador. For this reason, Valery Gerasimov has full confidence in the Wagner soldiers. It is estimated that the reason why Gerasimov did not use Russian soldiers in this attack is that there are too many novices and inexperienced soldiers in the army, and therefore he fears that this attack will fail. Thus, on Gerasimov's orders, 800 Wagner soldiers from the city of Soledar began to be sent to the back front. However, Wagner soldiers encountered something they never expected. As a result of the operation organized by the Ukrainian army, the Russian army was blockaded and nearly 200 Wagner soldiers had to surrender. If you come to the details of the news, as a result of the intensive work of the Ukrainian intelligence service, it was determined that there were Russian soldiers who started to be transferred to the Bakhmut front from the city of Salvador. Ukrainian soldiers organized reconnaissance flights with unmanned warplanes. They launched from the Bakhmut front and detected the route path, followed by the Russian army. The Ukrainian unit commander then contacted the commanders of Ukrainian units under the control of the Ukrainian army near the city of Bakhmut and requested support. Thus, the Ukrainian unit commander in the town of Lyman, which has been under the control of the Ukrainian army for a long time, decided to send his troops to the Bakhmut front. Unaware of anything, the Russian army reached the Bakhmut city border and started attacks against the Ukrainian army. After hours of clashes, a big surprise awaited the Russian army, which continued to attack. Unaware of anything, the Ukrainian army, which mobilized from the city of Lyman, reached the Bakhmut front and managed to blockade the Russian army. The Wagner soldiers who were blockaded by the Ukrainian army were surprised the Russian army suddenly switched from the attacking side to the defending side. As a result of the Ukrainian army's pressure from both sides, the Russian army was dealt a major blow after the Russian commander ordered his soldiers on the front line to retreat. Russian soldiers began to leave the region quickly. However, the Russian soldiers on the front, which was blockaded by the Ukrainian army, failed to move away from the region. Nearly 200 Russian soldiers who ran out of ammunition started to leave their weapons on the front line, realizing that they were abandoned by their own commanders. Russian soldiers started to leave the front line with their hands in the air. Ukrainian soldiers then arrested 2 surrendered Russian soldiers and took them to the Ukrainian army headquarters in Bakhmut. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's insistence on the Bakhmut front has once again failed, spectacularly creating chaos in the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin held a meeting in the Kremlin palace late at night. The meeting was attended by key figures such as Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. According to information obtained from regional sources, there was a great tension between Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, as it is known. Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, was put in command of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory by Vladimir Putin. However, Defense Minister Shoigu never supported Putin's decision given the opportunity. Shoigu blamed Valery Gerasimov for the failure of the Russian army in Bakhmut. Shoigu said that Gerasimov was not able to manage the Russian army well, and that although the Russian army had a lot of modern technology equipment, Gerasimov was unable to use it properly. Upon Shoigu's words, Gerasimov was said to have spoken very harsh words to Shoigu. According to the information obtained, Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov has never supported Vladimir Putin's decision of partial mobilization. Gerasimov, who expressed this during the meeting, stated that the vast majority of the soldiers in the Russian army are inexperienced and novice soldiers, and that the majority of Wagner soldiers are prisoners. Gerasimov said that Wagner soldiers fighting with the Russian army had no experience in war and had problems in obeying orders, and blamed Defense Minister Shoigu for this. Shoigu, who was one of the first to support Vladimir Putin's decision for partial mobilization, is known to be close to Putin. Gerasimov, on the other hand, stated that Shoigu was one of the main reasons for Putin's decision and targeted Sergei Shoigu as the main responsible for the failure of the Russian army in Ukraine. At the same time, Gerasimov also criticized the Russian intelligence service, saying that intelligence officers were not working well enough. In fact, Gerasimov's remarks here are mostly correct. Vladimir Putin has forcibly conscripted nearly 300,000 Russian citizens into the Russian army through partial mobilization and sent them to fight in Ukraine. However, many Russian war analysts have repeatedly stated that Putin's decision was extremely wrong and that the vast majority of these soldiers would lose their lives. And so it turned out. Since the beginning of the war, the number of Russian military casualties in Ukraine has reached over 200,000. The vast majority of these soldiers who have lost their lives are soldiers who were included in the army with the decision of partial mobilization. However, it is thought that Putin has other plans behind the partial mobilization decision. As it is known, the Russian government has been trying to colonize minority citizens living in Russia by implementing an assimilation policy for years. The decision for partial mobilization was an unmissable opportunity for Vladimir Putin. The fact that the majority of the citizens included in the army are minorities is seen as one of Putin's secret plans. Putin, who was estimated to be trying to reduce the number of minority citizens in Russia, more than half of the soldiers he included with the partial mobilization decision are minority citizens. Realizing this situation, many minority citizens took to the streets to protest against Putin. In autonomous republics such as the Crimean Peninsula, Dagestan, and Chechnya, people took to the streets and organized protests against Putin and the war. But these protests were suppressed by Putin. Putin will send Russian security forces to these autonomous republics, suppressed all the protests by using aggressive behavior against minority citizens. However, this anger of the minority population against Putin led to the formation of many resistance organizations. These resistance organizations emerged after the Russian army began to occupy Ukrainian territory, and their number increased even more after the decision of partial mobilization. These pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations are fighting hard to regulate the activities of the Russian army in Ukraine and Crimea. Ambulance sounds and the Kremlin palace made everyone uneasy. The disease that Vladimir Putin has been trying to hide for a long time has reappeared, weakened by the adverse conditions and pressures created by the war. Putin was hospitalized. The claims that Putin, whose illness has reappeared, will resign, have shaken the whole world agenda. It is known that Vladimir Putin, who served in the KGB for many years, struggled with many diseases during his tenure. Now, Putin, who is serving as the president of Russia, is still struggling with these diseases. Putin, who attended the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit held in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, in recent months, was seen to have difficulty walking. Putin, who had to walk while holding on to his close bodyguard, was too weak to even get off the plane on his own. But what really drew attention was Putin's inability to control his ends. It was known that Vladimir Putin had been struggling with Parkinson's disease for years. However, during his speech at the Shanghai summit, it became clear once again that Putin's Parkinson's disease has reached extremely advanced levels. With the escalation of the war between Russia and Ukraine and the Russian economy entering a turbulent period, the pressure on Putin has increased considerably. Putin, who continues his treatments regularly every month, did not stay in front of the cameras for a long time and kept his speeches short upon the warning of his doctors. Early yesterday, 6 ambulances arriving in front of the Kremlin palace created curiosity all over the world with the information obtained from sources close to the Kremlin. It was learned that Vladimir Putin was taken ill and hospitalized. Recently, it had attracted the attention of the Russian media. The trillion-Russian leader Putin was tired and exhibited behavioral disorders. Russian authorities decided to keep an ambulance waiting in front of the Kremlin palace for precautionary purposes after Vladimir Putin's sudden weight loss and sleep disorders. His regular monthly medical checkups were increased to twice a month after Putin's Parkinson's disease was triggered again. A doctor started to be constantly with him. After the Ukrainian army seized 3 towns and the city of Belgorod within Russia's borders. A meeting was planned with senior Russian officials and the Kremlin. Putin, who came to the meeting to be held in the early hours of the morning, took a short break after it was realized that he had difficulty in speaking while evaluating the situation. It is said that there was a discussion between Putin and Russian General Valery Gerasimov because of the operation organized by the Ukrainian army within the borders of Russia. During this discussion, Vladimir Putin suddenly began to tremble and lost consciousness. Within minutes, the sirens of ambulances arriving in front of the Kremlin palace echoed throughout Moscow. Putin was quickly removed from the meeting room and carried to the ambulance, accompanied by bodyguards escorting the ambulance. Vladimir Putin was taken to the nearest hospital and taken under treatment. According to information obtained from sources close to the Kremlin, it was confirmed that the person taken to the hospital was Vladimir Putin. But Russian government officials deny this. The Russian media, which continues to keep this incident a secret, is trying to make it look like it never happened. Upon the request of the press, members gathered in front of the palace for an explanation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that one of the staff working in the palace fell ill and was taken to the hospital for treatment. The fact that this incident was kept as a state secret, because even more curiosity, it is a known fact that Vladimir Putin has been struggling with Parkinson's disease for many years. In recent allegations, it was said that Putin started to use stunt doubles even in official meetings. Many Russian dissidents made a press release after this incident and stated that Vladimir Putin should resign, stating that a sick and old man should not be allowed to rule a country like Russia. Opposition officials think that Vladimir Putin should resign quickly and be replaced by someone younger and more dynamic. In the first months of the war, the Russian army was able to establish its control over Ukrainian territory very quickly. However, the sanctions and embargoes against Russia by the US and Western countries began to hit Putin hard. The Russian economy was being dragged towards the abyss. Aware of the situation, many expert researchers warned that efforts should be made to lift the sanctions imposed by the US and Western countries, and if necessary, the Russian army should withdraw from Ukrainian territory. However, Putin believes that if the Russian army withdraws from Ukraine, he will be disgraced all over the world. That's why he continues to occupy Ukrainian territory, despite everything. However, many war analysts say that if the war continues in this way, the Russian army will be forced to withdraw anyway. In recent months, Vladimir Putin addressed Western leaders in a speech calling for the lifting of sanctions against Russia. However, Putin's speech was again threatening, addressing Western countries. Putin said that Europe is hiding behind the United States, but Russia is much stronger than the United States and has hypersonic missiles, stating that any country that would pose a threat to Russia would be wiped off the map. Putin warned Western countries about this. However, despite all these threats, Western leaders are determined not to withdraw their support for Ukraine. Energy. One of Vladimir Putin's biggest trump cards is now being used as a threat. Since the beginning of the war, Putin has decided to stop the natural gas pipelines to Europe many times and has stopped the flow of natural gas to Europe under various pretexts. Many European countries, especially Germany, were forced to increase their energy prices. However, in a short time, Putin had to reopen these gas pipelines. Otherwise, the Russian army fighting in Ukraine would have run out of resources. Putin, who derives most of his income from energy exports, was aware that he could not cut off the flow of natural gas for a long time. Without energy exports, the financial resources of the Russian army in Ukraine would also be hit. While Vladimir Putin is struggling with his illness, on the one hand, Russian soldiers in Ukraine are also struggling with the disease on the other. The Russian army fighting on Ukrainian soil has recently started to suffer a lot of casualties. However, these injuries, Russian soldiers cannot access the medicines and doctors they need. For this reason, Russian soldiers serving in many Russian headquarters in Ukraine have started to protest against Putin, expressing that Vladimir Putin does not care about them. Russian soldiers say that they have great difficulties in terms of food and medicine. At the same time, there are no doctors in cities such as Belgorod and Kursk, which are close to Russia's border with Ukraine. The meter-long queues in front of the hospitals have started to annoy Russian citizens. While doctors are trying to treat wounded soldiers, on the one hand, they continue to treat ordinary patients on the other. However, the patience of doctors has also run out. Doctors are asking for more medicines and doctors to be sent to the cities near the Ukrainian border, saying that they cannot reach the wounded soldiers. With the escalation of the war and the increasing sanctions and embargoes against Russia, the pharmaceutical sector has also been badly affected. Russian citizens are now in a situation where they cannot even get the medicines they want from pharmacies, let alone treatment. For a while, the queues in front of pharmacies in Russia surprise everyone. Even if they had the medicines they wanted, They were only given a limited numbers. Russian citizens then tried to supply their own medicines with various methods. Russian citizens who visited the countries bordering Russia were obtaining the medicines they wanted from pharmacies in those countries during their visits. At the same time, many of their relatives were getting their medicines from these countries and bringing them back to the Russian border if the war continues like this. It seems that bigger crises await Russia. Thanks you for watching us.